The rain fell like judgment itself that night in the village of Ibadan. Thunder cracked across the sky with such force that children buried their faces in their mothers' arms, and old men whispered prayers to ancestors long departed. Lightning split the darkness, painting the mud houses white for half a heartbeat before plunging everything back into blackness deeper than any well. The storm had arrived without warning, as the most devastating things in life often do, turning the dusty paths into rivers of red mud and the peaceful village into a place of chaos and fear. In doorways across Ibadan, people huddled together, grateful for roofs over their heads, however leaky those roofs might be. They watched the storm with the resignation of those who have seen nature's fury before and know that all they can do is endure and pray. But at the edge of the village, in the smallest hut where the path ended and the forest began, a young woman named Adez stood in her doorway staring at something that would change her life forever. There, collapsed on her doorstep like a gift from the storm itself, was a stranger. His expensive shirt was torn and caked with mud. His face was pale beneath his dark skin, twisted in pain and fever. Blood mixed with rainwater on his forehead, creating crimson streams that disappeared into the storm. His breathing came in shallow gasps, each one sounding like it might be his last, and his eyes, when they opened briefly, held the wild confusion of someone lost between this world and the next. "Please," the stranger whispered, his voice barely audible above the roaring wind and relentless rain that pounded the earth like ancestral drums warning of danger. His hand reached toward Adaz, trembling not just from cold but from something deeper, some fundamental human need that transcended language or status or circumstance. Behind her, Adaz heard the shrill voice of old Mama Funka cutting through the storm from 3 houses down, sharp as broken glass and twice as dangerous. "Don't you dare, Adaz! That man could be a thief, a ritualist, a madman escaped from somewhere evil. Let him find shelter elsewhere, girl. Don't bring trouble to your door." Other voices joined in, a chorus of fear and suspicion that rose even above the thunder. Neighbors who suddenly had opinions about her business, though they had never cared about her welfare before. But Adaz saw something they didn't see, something her mother had taught her to look for in people when the world was dark and confusing. She saw his trembling hands, not trembling from cold, but from fever that was cooking him from the inside. She saw the gash on his forehead, deep and angry, the kind of wound that without care would turn poisonous and deadly. She saw expensive leather shoes now ruined by mud, clothes that had once cost more than everything she owned, a watch that caught the lightning and gleamed like captured starlight even through the filth. But more than all of this, more than the expensive things that marked him as someone from another world entirely, Adaz saw something fundamental and undeniable. She saw a human being who would die in this storm if she turned away. She saw someone's son, someone's brother, someone's loved one who had people somewhere praying for his safe return, not knowing he was collapsed on a poor girl's doorstep, fighting for every breath. Her own hands began to tremble as the weight of the decision pressed down on her shoulders like the storm itself. The voices of her neighbors grew louder, more insistent, warning her against kindness, as if compassion were a disease that could infect and destroy. The stranger's eyes opened again, unfocused and desperate, and in them she saw the same look her mother had worn in those final days when death was circling and comfort seemed like a distant dream. Something in Adaz's chest cracked open then, some place where her mother's voice still lived, whispering the lessons that poverty and hardship had tried but failed to erase. Every stranger might be an angel, her mother used to say, while braiding Adaz's hair in the evenings when the world was quiet and wisdom flowed like honey. And the angels are always watching to see what we do when no one else can see, when there's nothing to gain, when helping costs us everything we have. Adaz made her choice in that moment, the choice that would set everything else in motion, like dominoes arranged by fate itself. "Come," she said softly, kneeling in the mud beside the stranger, her voice steady despite the fear that coiled in her stomach like a serpent waiting to strike. "I don't have much, but I have a roof. Tonight, that's enough." She hooked her arms under his shoulders, shocked by how heavy he was, how much dead weight a sick man could become, how difficult it was to drag him across her threshold into the meager shelter of her hut. The village watched from cracked doorways and rain-blurred windows as this poor girl, this girl who barely had food for herself most days, dragged a stranger into her home and closed the door on their warnings and judgment. They shook their heads slowly, the way people do when they've already decided someone is making a terrible mistake. They whispered to each other in that special tone reserved for gossip that feels righteous, words that would spread through Ibadan like wildfire by morning, turning her act of mercy into something suspicious and shameful. They judged her with the casual cruelty of those who have never had to choose between their safety and someone else's life. They didn't know, couldn't know, that they were watching destiny unfold in real time, that the universe was setting pieces on a board they couldn't see for a game whose rules they didn't understand. As Adaz laid the stranger on her only mat, the thin, worn thing that barely cushioned her bones from the hard earth beneath, she felt the magnitude of what she'd done settle over her like a heavy cloth. She covered him with her only dry wrapper, the good one she saved for market days, and knelt beside him in her leaking hut, while rain dripped through 7 different holes in her roof, each one playing a different note like some cruel musical instrument. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, born from years of caring for her dying mother, years of making do with nothing, years of stretching meager resources into miracles of survival. She collected rainwater in her only pot, the one she used for cooking and washing and every other task that required water, and she used it to clean the wound on his forehead with cloth torn from her second dress, the one she'd been saving in case the first one fell apart completely. The stranger drifted in and out of consciousness, his skin burning with fever so intense she could feel the heat radiating from him, like standing too close to a cooking fire. He mumbled words she couldn't understand, fragments of sentences that might have been names or prayers or simply the confused babbling of a mind untethered by sickness. Once his eyes snapped open with sudden clarity, and he grabbed her wrist with surprising strength, his fingers digging into her skin with desperate urgency. "Don't trust him," he said, his voice sharp and clear for just a moment, before the fever dragged him back under. "Don't trust anyone." Adaz had no idea who he meant or what danger he was warning her about, but she soothed him anyway with the gentle voice her mother had used on her when childhood nightmares made the darkness unbearable. Through the long night she maintained her vigil, this poor village girl with nothing to her name, except a leaking hut and a stubborn heart that refused to become cynical no matter how many times the world tried to teach her that lesson. She brewed tea from the herbs her mother had taught her about, the ones that grew wild near the river and held properties that could break fevers and fight infections if you knew how to use them properly. She forced the bitter liquid between his lips, drop by precious drop, while the storm raged outside as if the sky itself was angry at the world below. Her back ached from sitting in one position. Her eyes burned with exhaustion. Her stomach growled with hunger because she'd given him the last of her drinking water and had none left for herself. But she didn't stop, didn't rest, didn't question whether this stranger was worth the sacrifice she was making. Outside, the village slept fitfully, people dreaming their small dreams behind closed doors, safe and comfortable in their judgment of her foolishness. They didn't see her fighting death in that tiny hut. They didn't see her willing this stranger to live through sheer determination and ancestral remedies. They didn't see the tears that slipped down her cheeks when his breathing steadied and the fever finally began to break as dawn approached. By the time pale light started filtering through the cracks in her walls, the stranger was sleeping peacefully, his chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of someone who had been pulled back from the edge and would survive to see another day. Daisy finally allowed herself to close her eyes, exhaustion pulling her under like a tide. She could no longer resist. She slept sitting up, her back against the wall, her body positioned between the stranger and the door, as if even in sleep she was protecting him from whatever might come through. She dreamed of her mother again, that same field of impossible sunflowers that didn't exist in any place she knew. Her mother wearing that dress too fine for real life, smiling with a knowledge that transcended death. "I'm proud of you, my daughter," her mother said in the dream, reaching out to touch Daisy's face with hands that felt warm and real. "You did the right thing. You always do the right thing, even when it costs you everything." When Daisy woke a few hours later, the sun was already climbing in the sky and the storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean but muddy, renewed but exhausted. She looked immediately to the mat where the stranger had slept, her heart already knowing what her eyes would confirm. He was gone. The mat was empty except for a damp spot where his body had been. The wrapper she'd covered him with was folded neatly at the foot of the mat, a gesture of courtesy that somehow made his absence feel even more final. There was no note, no explanation, no goodbye. Just wet footprints leading to the door and then disappearing into the muddy path outside, heading toward the main road as if he'd never been there at all. For a moment, a brief and painful moment, Daisy felt something sharp twist in her chest. Not anger exactly, and not quite hurt, but something that tasted like disappointment mixed with a foolish surprise that she had expected anything different. What had she thought would happen? That this wealthy stranger would wake up and suddenly want to be friends with a poor village girl? That he would thank her profusely and offer some grand reward like in the Folktales her mother used to tell? She laughed at herself, a bitter sound that echoed in her empty hut, and began the work of putting her life back in order. The wrapper needed washing. The mat needed drying. Her dress was ruined with mud and blood. Another loss she could barely afford. She stepped outside into the bright morning, squinting against sunlight that felt too cheerful for how she felt inside, and immediately knew something was wrong. The village was watching her again, but this time the energy was different, not curious, not merely judgmental, something darker, something that made the hair on her arms stand up in warning. Old Mama Funka stood near the water pump with 3 other women, their heads close together, their eyes sharp and assessing as they looked at Adaz. Young men loitered near the path to her house, whispering and pointing, their faces showing that particular expression men get when they're making assumptions about a woman's virtue. Even the children playing in the puddles left by last night's rain kept glancing her way with the frank curiosity of youth who sense scandal, even if they don't understand it. Kioma was the first to approach, her face arranged in an expression of concern so false it was almost insulting. She walked carefully to avoid the worst of the mud, her wrapper held high to protect the expensive fabric from the dirt that Adais waded through without thought. "Adaizi, my sister, we need to talk," Kioma said, her voice dripping with that particular sweetness that always preceded cruelty. "That man you brought into your house last night, the stranger you spent all night alone with behind closed doors." She let the implication hang in the air between them, like smoke, poisonous and designed to choke. Adaz felt anger rising in her throat, hot and bitter, but she forced her voice to remain calm and steady. He was sick, she said simply, meeting Kioma's eyes without flinching. He was dying. He needed help. I gave it, but Kioma wasn't alone anymore. Other women had gathered, drawn by the scent of potential gossip, the way vultures are drawn to dying things, their faces showing that mix of judgment and excitement that people get when someone else's tragedy gives them something interesting to discuss. Sick. Kioma's voice rose theatrically, performing now for her audience. Or dangerous. Do you even know who he was, where he came from, what he might have done to you in the night? He could have been a ritualist looking for young women to use for his evil practices. He could have been a thief who would have stolen everything you own and slit your throat besides. And you, a young woman alone with no man to protect you, you brought him into your house in the middle of the night? Other voices joined in then, creating a chorus of accusation dressed up in the costume of concern, each woman adding her own particular flavor of judgment to the collective condemnation. It's not proper, Adaze. A decent woman doesn't do such things. Your mother would be ashamed to see how you've forgotten every lesson she tried to teach you about reputation and dignity. This is why you'll never get ahead, why no decent man will marry you, why you'll always be poor and alone and struggling. You've always been too trusting, too soft, too willing to believe the best in people who don't deserve it. The words came at her like stones thrown by people who had perfected the art of wounding without using their hands. People who could draw blood with nothing but carefully chosen phrases and perfectly timed silences. Adaze stood in her doorway, wrapped in her mud-stained dress, and felt the familiar weight of their words, pressing down on her shoulders like a physical burden she had carried so many times before. She had learned over the years how to bear this weight, how to let their judgment roll off her back like the rain that had fallen last night. But knowing how to carry something doesn't make it any lighter. "I did what was right," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the trembling she felt inside. "If that's shameful to you, then go ahead and shame me. I'll survive your judgment just like I've survived everything else." She turned to go back inside, to escape the watching eyes and wagging tongues, but her cousin Neka's voice stopped her cold. "Adaze, wait, cousin, please wait." Neka's voice cut through the murmuring crowd, sharp with urgency that sounded almost genuine. She approached quickly, her expensive sandals splashing through puddles she usually avoided with elaborate care, her wrapper hiked up to protect the costly fabric from the mud that Adaze wore like a second skin. Neka's face was flushed, her eyes bright with something Adaze couldn't quite name but instinctively distrusted. Behind her, Neka's husband Darius hung back, his face carefully neutral in that way powerful men have when they want to observe without appearing to participate. "Cousin, I heard what happened last night," Neka said, slightly breathless from her hurried approach. "Everyone's talking about it. The whole village knows you brought that stranger into your house. You need to be more careful about your reputation, about what people will say about you." She lowered her voice conspiratorially, as if sharing a secret meant to help rather than harm. "You're already at the bottom of the village hierarchy, Adaze. You can't afford to dig yourself deeper into disgrace. Every choice you make is watched and judged 10 times more harshly because of your poverty. That's just how the world works." Adaze felt something cold settle in her stomach, the instinctive knowledge that whatever was coming next would hurt more than the judgment of strangers. "But that's not really why I came," Neka continued, glancing back at her husband who nodded slightly, giving permission for whatever script they had rehearsed together. "I came to talk to you about something important, something that could actually help your situation if you'd just be practical for once in your life." They went inside, away from the watching eyes and hungry ears of the village gossips, who would have to imagine rather than hear what happened next. Neka looked around Adaze's tiny hut, her nose wrinkling with barely concealed disgust at the poverty she could never quite hide her contempt for, no matter how many times she claimed to care about her unfortunate cousin. The leaks in the roof had left puddles on the floor. The walls needed fresh clay. The whole place smelled of damp earth and old smoke and the particular scent of grinding poverty that never quite washes away. "It's about your father's land," Neka began without preamble, getting straight to the point now that they were alone and pretense wasn't necessary. "The 3 acres by the river where the soil is rich and the water runs clean, even in drought season. You know the land, I mean." Daisy's stomach tightened painfully, her instincts screaming danger even though she didn't yet know the specific form that danger would take. "What about it?" she asked carefully, keeping her voice neutral, not giving anything away. Neka's smile was sugar poured over poison, sweet on the surface but deadly underneath. "Well, technically, it was supposed to be divided among all of Uncle Chukwudi's children when he died. You and your sisters, a fair split between the 3 of you. But your sisters are both married now and living in other villages with their husbands' families. They don't farm it. They don't need it. The land is just sitting there, Adas, doing nothing productive, going to waste year after year while you struggle alone." "I farm it," Adazi said, her voice harder now, defensive against the attack she could feel building like storm clouds on the horizon. "Every single season I work that land. I plant cassava and yams. I harvest what grows. That land feeds me." But Neka waved her hand dismissively, brushing away Adaizi's words like they were annoying insects rather than statements of fact. Yes, you try to farm it, I know. But let's be honest, cousin, you can't work it properly alone. You don't have help, you don't have equipment, you don't have the money to buy good seeds or fertilizer. Every year the harvest gets smaller and smaller. The land is dying under your care because you simply don't have the resources to do it justice." She leaned forward, her voice taking on that tone of false confidentiality that always preceded betrayal. "But what if there was a better use for that land? What if someone with actual resources wanted to develop it properly? My husband's brother Tay wants to build a fish farm, a big commercial operation that would bring jobs to the village, money to the local economy. He's willing to pay for the land, Adaizi, 50,000 naira, cash in hand, money you could use right now to fix this house, to buy new clothes, to maybe even start a small business in the market selling something besides the pathetic vegetables from your failing garden." Adazi stared at her cousin, understanding settling over her like a cold fog that chilled her bones. That land was worth 10 times what Neka was offering, maybe more. Any fool who knew anything about property values could see that land by the river was precious, increasingly valuable as water became scarcer and good farming land harder to find. "That land is worth far more than 50,000, Adazi said quietly, her voice steady despite the anger building inside her like a fire that needed only a spark to explode. "And it's all I have left of my father. It's my inheritance, my birthright, the only thing connecting me to the family I've lost." Neka's sweet expression began to curdle around the edges, the mask slipping slightly to reveal the calculation underneath. "Sentiment doesn't fill your stomach, cousin. Nostalgia doesn't repair your roof or buy you medicine when you're sick. You need to be practical, to think about your survival rather than your feelings. Besides, you're not doing that land justice. You're barely scratching out an existence while it could be used for something greater, something that benefits more people than just you." She stood up, brushing imaginary dirt from her expensive wrapper, preparing to leave now that her offer had been made and her true purpose revealed. "Think about it carefully, Adaze. This is a generous offer, more generous than you deserve given your situation. Don't let pride or sentiment make you stupid. You need this money. You need this chance. Don't throw it away because of some childish attachment to dirt and memories. Adazi stood as well, her back straight despite the exhaustion pulling at her bones, her voice quiet but final. No. The word hung between them, solid as stone and just as immovable. The land is mine. It stays mine. Tell Tay and Darius and whoever else is part of this scheme that my father's land is not for sale at any price, but especially not at an insult disguised as charity. Neka's face transformed completely then, all pretense of concern evaporating like water on hot coals. You're making a terrible mistake, Neka hissed, her voice dropping to something cold and vicious. A mistake you'll regret for the rest of your miserable life. Don't say I didn't try to help you, didn't offer you a way out of this poverty you seem so determined to wallow in. When you're starving and alone and desperate, remember this moment. Remember that you chose pride over survival. She swept out of the hut without another word, leaving Adazi standing alone in the dim interior, her hands trembling with anger and fear and the terrible knowledge that this wasn't over. Neka didn't accept defeat gracefully. People with power and money never did. They simply changed tactics, found new angles, used different weapons. Adazi sat down on her thin mat and tried to stop her hands from shaking, tried to calm the panic rising in her chest, like floodwater threatening to drown her. She knew what was coming next. She had seen it before, had watched it happen to other poor people who dared to say no to those with resources and connections. When you're poor and you say no to powerful people, they don't accept your decision. They don't respect your boundaries. They find ways to make you regret your defiance, to punish your audacity, to force you into compliance through methods that look legal and proper, but are really just bullying dressed up in official language. She was right to be afraid. 3 days later, a man came from the village council, appearing at her door like a messenger of doom. He wore a too-tight suit that had probably been impressive 20 years ago, but now just made him look uncomfortable and slightly ridiculous. He carried papers that crackled with official importance, documents covered in stamps and signatures that meant nothing to Adazi, but everything to people who believed power came from paperwork. Behind him stood Darius, Neka's husband, his face carefully blank but his eyes showing satisfaction, poorly hidden behind a mask of neutral concern. Adazi Chukwudi, the councilman said in a voice designed to sound authoritative, reading from his papers like they were holy scripture. There has been a complaint filed with the village council regarding the land left to you by your late father Chukwudi. A formal claim has been made that the original distribution of that property was not properly documented according to traditional law and modern legal requirements. Until this matter is thoroughly investigated and resolved to the satisfaction of all parties involved, you are hereby forbidden from farming that land or harvesting any crops currently growing there. Adazi felt the ground shifting beneath her feet, the earth opening up to swallow everything she had left. Without that land, she had nothing. The small plot around her house was barely enough to grow vegetables for her own consumption, let alone provide any income or surplus for trade. That riverland was her livelihood, her insurance against complete destitution, her only buffer between bare survival and absolute poverty. What? Her voice came out strangled, choked by shock and disbelief. That's my land. My father left it to me and my sisters. There's no dispute, no confusion. Everyone in this village knows. But the councilman held up his hand, silencing her with the casual authority of someone who had learned that poor people's protests were just noise to be ignored. The matter is being formally investigated, he interrupted, his voice bored now, having delivered his message and ready to move on to more important things. These procedures take time. require proper review of all documentation and testimony. Meanwhile, any crops you plant on that disputed property will be considered questionable assets, potentially subject to seizure or redistribution, depending on the outcome of the investigation. I suggest you cooperate fully and don't make this situation more complicated than it needs to be." He turned to leave, his duty done, his conscience apparently clear about participating in this obvious theft. Adaz found her voice again, desperation giving her courage she didn't know she had. "Who filed this complaint? Who claims my father's land wasn't properly distributed? I have a right to know who's accusing me." The councilman didn't answer directly, just gestured vaguely toward some undefined authority that apparently didn't require explanation or accountability. But Darius's eyes told her everything she needed to know. They gleamed with satisfaction, with the particular pleasure powerful people take in crushing those who dare to defy them. He didn't say a word, didn't need to. His expression was confession enough. After they left, Adaz stood in her doorway and watched them walk away through the village. The councilman and her cousin's husband, their backs straight with the confidence of people who never doubted they would get what they wanted. Around her, neighbors peered from their windows and doorways, watching this latest drama unfold, some with pity, most with the resigned acceptance of people who understood that this was how the world worked and fighting it was futile. That night, Daisy didn't cry. She was too angry for tears, too furious to waste energy on grief when rage burned hotter and cleaner in her chest. She paced her small hut like a caged animal, her mind racing through options that didn't exist, solutions that required resources she didn't have. She could fight this in court if she had money for a lawyer, but lawyers cost more than she would earn in 5 years. She could appeal to the village elders if they weren't all friends with Darius's family, connected by marriage or business or the complex web of obligation and favor that governed village politics. She could report the corruption to the police if the police cared about poor women's property disputes, which they absolutely did not unless there was money in it for them. She could do nothing. That was the truth she kept circling back to, the hard reality that poverty meant powerlessness, and powerlessness meant being crushed by anyone who wanted what you had. When you're poor, justice is just a word people use to make oppression sound official and legitimate. The law protects property, but only if you have enough property to be worth protecting. But the worst betrayal, the deepest cut, the wound that would leave a scar she'd carry forever, was still coming. On the 5th day after the storm, Adaz was at the market trying to sell the last of her small harvest from the plot around her house. The vegetables she'd managed to grow in soil, too, depleted to yield much of anything. She needed money desperately now, needed every kobo she could scrape together to survive, until she figured out what to do about the land dispute that was really just theft wearing official clothes. A hand grabbed her arm suddenly, pulling her aside into the space between 2 stalls, where the shadows fell thick and private conversations could happen away from curious eyes. It was Kwame, a young man from the next village who had been courting her gently for months, with offerings of fish from his catches and small compliments delivered shyly. She had never encouraged him, had never given him reason to hope for more than friendship, but she had appreciated his kindness in a world that seemed determined to teach her that kindness was foolish. "Adaz, I need to talk to you," he said urgently, his voice low and his eyes refusing to meet hers directly, looking instead at the ground between them, where ants marched in determined lines toward some destination only they understood. "What is it, Kwame?" she asked, her heart already sinking, because she knew from his tone that whatever he had to say would hurt. His shoulders hunched, his body language screaming discomfort and shame. I can't see you anymore. I'm sorry. I wish things were different, but they're not, and I have to think about my family, my future, my reputation in the community." He finally looked up, and she saw genuine regret in his eyes, which somehow made it worse. "My family says, they say you're cursed now, that you bring trouble wherever you go. That strange man you helped during the storm, the scandal of having him in your house all night, and now these problems with your land and the village council. People are talking adays. They're saying that fate is against you, that association with you is dangerous, that bad luck follows you like a shadow and spreads to anyone foolish enough to stand close." Something in Adazi's chest cracked, not her heart, because that had grown too tough to break so easily after years of hardship, but something deeper, some last piece of hope, that people could be good just for the sake of being good, that human connection could survive the test of adversity. "I see," she said quietly, her voice so calm it surprised even her. "Thank you for your honesty, Kwame. It's more than most people bother with when they're abandoning someone." He flinched at the word abandoning, clearly uncomfortable with such a direct description of what he was doing. "I'm sorry," he repeated, the words hollow and useless. "I really am. You're a good person, Adaz. You deserve better than this. But I have to think of my family's reputation. You understand, don't you? You understand that I don't have a choice." She understood perfectly. She understood that he absolutely had a choice, that everyone always had a choice, but that choosing to be brave and loyal was harder than choosing to be safe and self-serving. She understood that good people weren't good when it was easy, but when it cost them something, and by that measure Kwame wasn't good at all, just comfortable. "I understand," she said, giving him the absolution he was seeking, not because he deserved it, but because she was tired of fighting, and this wasn't a battle worth her energy. "Go on, Kwame. Go protect your reputation. I'll survive your absence just like I've survived everything else." He walked away quickly, relief evident in every line of his body, grateful to escape without a scene or complications. Adaz stood in the market surrounded by people and feeling more alone than she ever had in her empty hut at the edge of the village. The noise and bustle of commerce continued around her, vendors calling out their wares, customers haggling over prices, children weaving through the crowds, laughing and playing, life going on as if her world wasn't collapsing around her ears. She looked down at her small pile of vegetables, pathetic and wilting in the afternoon heat, and felt the absurdity of trying to sell them as if money from these few sad yams could solve any of her problems. That's when she realized it wasn't just a storm outside. That night when she opened her door to a dying stranger, it was a storm of fate, a hurricane of destiny that had been building long before the rain started falling, and she was standing in the center of it, being torn apart by winds she couldn't see and rains that wouldn't stop, forces beyond her control that were reshaping her life whether she consented or not. But Adas didn't know something crucial, something that would change everything. She didn't know that storms, when they finally pass, leave the air clean and fresh. She didn't know that the darkest hour comes just before dawn, that collapse and rebuilding are two sides of the same coin, that sometimes you have to lose everything before you can truly find anything. And she didn't know that 70 miles away in the city, in a glass-walled office overlooking streets she'd never walked and buildings she'd never enter, a man with a small bandage on his forehead was making phone calls that would alter the trajectory of her entire existence. "So find her," Olamide Adeleke said to his head of security, a former military man who had never failed an assignment and wasn't about to start now. "Find the woman who saved my life during the storm. I don't care how long it takes. I don't care what resources you need to use. Find her." He had been searching for 5 days, ever since he woke up in a hospital bed surrounded by worried family members and frantic business partners, everyone demanding to know where he'd been, what had happened, why he'd disappeared for an entire night. He had told them about the storm, about his car breaking down on a rural highway, about walking for miles in the rain until fever and exhaustion had dropped him at some stranger's door. But when they asked where exactly, what village, what address, he had realized with horror that he didn't know. He had been too sick, too disoriented, too focused on simply surviving to pay attention to landmarks or signs. He remembered mud houses, he remembered kindness, he remembered a woman with gentle hands and a voice that kept him tethered to the world when death would have been easier. But he didn't remember names or locations, and that ignorance had been eating at him like acid for 5 days straight. He was Olamide Adeleke, CEO of one of the largest conglomerates in the country, a man with resources most people couldn't imagine, and he couldn't find the one person he needed to find more than anyone else in the world. "I have a lead, sir," his head of security said, looking up from his tablet where information scrolled past faster than most people could read. "Hospital records show you were brought in with herbs in your system, traditional medicine not typically used in the city. The combination suggests someone with knowledge of rural healing practices. Cross-referencing that with the location where your car was found, there are 3 villages within walking distance. I'll send teams to all 3. We'll find her, sir. I promise you that." Olamide nodded, relief and anticipation mixing in his chest until he could barely breathe. He had spent 5 days trying to focus on business meetings and corporate decisions while his mind kept drifting back to that night, to that woman, to the profound impact her simple act of kindness had made on his understanding of the world. He was 35 years old, had been wealthy his entire life, and had never once experienced genuine compassion that didn't come with strings attached. Every relationship, every interaction, every kindness shown to him had been filtered through his bank account and social status. People smiled at him because he was rich. They laughed at his jokes because he was powerful. They helped him because they wanted something in return. But that woman, that poor village girl whose name he didn't even know, had saved his life expecting nothing, wanting nothing, asking for nothing. She had given everything she had to a stranger who might have been anyone, might have been dangerous, might have brought trouble to her door. And that act of pure, uncomplicated generosity had done something to him, changed something fundamental in his understanding of human nature and his own place in a world where money could buy almost anything, except the one thing that mattered most: genuine human connection, untainted by transaction. It took his security team exactly 18 hours to find her. They arrived in Ibadan village with the efficiency of people who had located kidnapped victims in foreign countries and recovered stolen assets from criminal syndicates. So one poor girl in a rural village was hardly a challenge. They spoke to villagers, showed photographs. Olamide had somehow managed to remember her face well enough to describe to a sketch artist, asked questions with the polite persistence of people who would get their answers one way or another. And when they found her, found that tiny leaking hut at the edge of the village where the path ended and the forest began, they reported back with information that made Olamide's blood run cold with rage. They told him about the land dispute, about the corrupt village council, about Nneka and Darius's scheme to steal her inheritance, about the systematic isolation, the way the entire village had turned against her for the crime of showing mercy to a stranger, about Kwame's abandonment and the whispered accusations of being cursed. His security chief delivered the report with professional detachment, just facts and observations, without editorial comment, but Olamide could read between the lines. This woman who had saved his life was being destroyed for it, punished for her kindness by a community that should have celebrated her compassion. The universe had a sick sense of humor, rewarding goodness with suffering while people like Nneka and Darius prospered through manipulation and theft. But Olamide Adeleke hadn't built an empire by accepting injustice when he had the power to correct it. "Prepare a convoy," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the absolute authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I want 50 vehicles minimum. Call every business partner who owes me a favor. Get the governor's office on the phone. Contact the national news networks and tell them I have a story about corruption in local governance that they'll want to cover. And get me the best property lawyers in the country. I don't care what they're doing or what it costs to pull them away. I want them ready to move today." His staff exchanged glances, recognizing that particular tone their boss got when someone had made the mistake of harming something he cared about. They had seen him dismantle competitors who played dirty, watched him systematically destroy business rivals who crossed ethical lines, witnessed his particular brand of ruthless justice that looked legal and proper but left his enemies broken and ruined. But this was different. This wasn't business. This was personal in a way they'd never seen before, and that made it more dangerous for anyone standing on the wrong side of his intentions. Within 3 hours, a convoy began assembling in Lagos that would have made presidential motorcades look modest by comparison. Luxury cars, SUVs with tinted windows, news vans with satellite equipment, vehicles carrying lawyers with briefcases full of documents that could bury corrupt officials under legal language they wouldn't understand until it was too late. Word spread through certain circles that Olamide Adeleke was moving against someone, and like vultures sensing blood, people came to watch or participate, to be part of whatever was about to happen, to witness the kind of power that money and influence could wield when properly motivated. The convoy left Lagos at dawn, a river of expensive metal and glass flowing toward a village that had no idea its entire reality was about to shift. They drove through the morning, past cities that gave way to towns that gave way to rural communities where children stopped playing to stare at the impossible sight of such wealth passing through their world. News helicopters followed overhead, filming what was becoming the story of the day across every major network. Social media exploded with speculation and theories, people sharing videos and photos of the convoy, everyone wanting to know where it was going and why. By the time they reached the outskirts of Ibadan village, the sun was high and hot, and the village had gathered near the main road, having heard rumors of something extraordinary approaching. They stood in clusters, confused and excited and slightly afraid, watching as car after expensive car turned onto the narrow path that barely qualified as a road, vehicles worth more than everything in the village combined. The convoy moved slowly, carefully, navigating the muddy ruts and potholes with the patience of people who had a destination in mind and wouldn't be deterred by obstacles. And as they moved deeper into the village, past the water pump and the small market and the houses of families who had lived there for generations, people began to realize with dawning shock exactly where these vehicles were heading. They were going to the edge of the village, to the smallest hut, to Adaise's house. Adaise was inside her hut when she heard it, the sound of engines that didn't belong in her world, the noise of wealth and power approaching with unstoppable momentum. She stepped into her doorway and froze, her mind unable to process what her eyes were seeing. The path to her house, that narrow, muddy track that barely fit one person walking comfortably, was lined with luxury vehicles as far as she could see. Mercedes, Range Rovers, Bentley's cars she'd only ever glimpsed in passing when the occasional wealthy traveler's vehicle broke down near the village and had to be towed away. And at the head of this impossible procession, a man was stepping out of the lead vehicle, his expensive suit somehow making him look more powerful rather than out of place, his face bearing a small bandage on his forehead that she recognized instantly. The stranger, the man from the storm, but not a stranger anymore, and clearly not just any man. Behind him, people emerged from vehicles like an army mobilizing, lawyers in professional attire, journalists with cameras already rolling, security personnel with the bearing of people trained for violence but hoping it wouldn't be necessary. The entire village had followed the convoy, hundreds of people pressing close to witness whatever was about to happen, their faces showing confusion and fear and the dawning realization that something huge was unfolding. Olamide Adeleke walked toward Adese's hut with the confidence of someone who owned the ground beneath his feet, and when he reached her doorway, he stopped and met her eyes with an expression that held gratitude and determination, and something else she couldn't quite name. "Oh, Adese," he said, and even though he shouldn't have known her name, somehow he did, his security team having done their job with characteristic thoroughness. "My name is Olamide Adeleke. 5 days ago you saved my life. You gave me everything you had, your shelter, your food, your care, your protection, expecting nothing in return. You showed me what true kindness looks like, what genuine humanity means in a world where I thought everything had a price." His voice carried across the gathered crowd, and cameras captured every word, broadcasting this moment to millions of people across the country who were watching with fascination and disbelief. "I've spent 5 days searching for you, and when I found you, I learned something that makes my blood boil with rage. I learned that you've been punished for your kindness, that corrupt people have tried to steal your inheritance, that your own family has betrayed you, that this village has turned against you for the crime of having a compassionate heart." He turned then, his eyes scanning the crowd until they found Neka and Darius, trying to hide in the press of bodies, their faces pale with dawning horror. "Is that them?" he asked Adese quietly. She nodded, unable to speak, her throat tight with emotions she couldn't name. Olamide gestured, and his lawyers moved forward like sharks scenting blood. "Darius and Neka Okonkwo, you are hereby served with legal documents charging you with fraud, conspiracy to commit theft, and corruption of local government officials. The land dispute you initiated through bribery has been investigated by actual authorities rather than your paid village council. The evidence is overwhelming and damning." The lawyers handed over thick folders of documents, while cameras captured every moment of their public humiliation. "Furthermore," Olamide continued, his voice cutting through the shocked murmurs of the crowd, "I've purchased the 3 acres of land adjacent to Adese's father's property, not to develop, not to profit from, but to gift to her, expanding her inheritance rather than stealing from it. And I've established a legal trust that will protect her property rights in perpetuity, managed by lawyers who answer only to her and cannot be bribed or intimidated by local corruption." He turned back to Adaz, his expression softening. "You saved my life when you had every reason not to. You showed me kindness when the world had taught you that kindness was dangerous. You gave everything expecting nothing, and that generosity changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand." The village watched in stunned silence as this powerful man, this billionaire who could buy their entire community without noticing the expense, stood before their poorest member with something that looked remarkably like humility. Neka had collapsed to her knees in the mud, her expensive wrapper ruined, her face a mask of horror, as she realized her scheme had destroyed not Adese, but herself. The village councilman who had delivered the false land dispute notices was being questioned by actual authorities who had arrived with the convoy, his too-tight suit now soaked with nervous sweat. And old Mama Funka, who had warned Adaz not to help a stranger, stood silent for perhaps the first time in her life, watching destiny unfold in ways her small mind had never imagined possible. In the weeks that followed, Ibadan village learned what it meant to be touched by consequence and grace in equal measure. Neka and Darius were prosecuted for fraud, their assets seized, their reputations destroyed so thoroughly that they had to leave the village entirely and start over somewhere no one knew their names. The corrupt council officials were removed from their positions, replaced by people who actually understood that power was meant to serve rather than oppress. Kwame tried to come back, tried to apologize and resume his gentle courtship, but Adais looked at him with eyes that had seen too much to be fooled by fair-weather affection, and told him politely but firmly that she deserved someone who chose her when it was hard, not just when it became convenient. And Adais herself, that poor village girl who had opened her door to a dying stranger during a storm, found her life transformed in ways that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with dignity restored. Olamide returned often, drawn back to Ibadan and to Adais by something deeper than gratitude, something that grew slowly like seeds planted in good soil. He courted her properly with patience and respect, proving through actions rather than words that his intentions were genuine. He helped her repair her hut, then built her a new house, modest by his standards but a palace by village measures. He ensured her father's land was not just protected, but thriving, hiring agricultural experts to teach her modern farming techniques that honored traditional wisdom. And slowly, carefully watching for her consent at every step, he showed her that not all strangers are dangerous, not all power corrupts, and sometimes the universe does reward goodness even when it seems impossible. They married eventually, this billionaire and this village girl, in a ceremony that bridged two worlds and reminded everyone who witnessed it that love recognizes no boundaries except those we create ourselves. Adais never forgot where she came from or the lessons poverty had taught her about resilience and compassion. She used her new resources to transform Ibadan village, building schools and clinics, creating opportunities for young people who had known only limitation, proving that kindness received and multiplied could change not just individual lives but entire communities. And on quiet evenings when the storms came and rain fell like judgment on the world, she would stand in her doorway, a much nicer doorway now, but still facing the forest where paths ended and mysteries began, and remember that night when she had chosen compassion over caution, mercy over safety, humanity over fear. She would remember her mother's words about angels watching to see what we do when no one else can see, when there's nothing to gain, when helping costs us everything we have. And she would smile, knowing that her mother had been right all along, that the universe does keep accounts even when we think no one is watching, that storms pass but the choices we make in them echo through eternity. The storyteller's voice would whisper through those storms, speaking the ancient truth that every folktale has tried to teach, that kindness is never wasted, that what we give comes back to us multiplied beyond recognition, and that sometimes the stranger at your door in the darkness is not a test of your fear but an opportunity for your transformation. Open your door, share your bread, show mercy even when it costs you everything, because the angels are always watching, and destiny has a way of rewarding those who choose light even when surrounded by darkness. This is the way the world works if only we have eyes to see it and hearts brave enough to believe it.